Welcome back. It's our great honor for having Mr. Roland Hunziker, Director, Built Environment, World Business Council for Sustainable Development, to give us a keynote speech today. Although Mr. Hunziker cannot join us in person today, he has recorded a video to set the scene for today's discussion. Let's watch the video now.
Dear Simon, dear colleagues at the Business Environment Council, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for inviting me to present to you today during your EnviroSeries conference, Stocktaking Hong Kong's Climate Action. My name is Roland Hunziker. I'm the Director Built Environment at the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, WBCSD. I'm based in Geneva, Switzerland. I would like to speak to you about the importance and need of deep collaboration so that we achieve our ambitious goals of driving towards a net zero built environment globally. I will start by talking about some of the key trends that we are seeing today. The first one is bad news, that emissions from the built environment continue to increase globally. In 2022, according to the Global Status Report for Buildings and Construction, the built environment emitted almost 14 gigatons of CO2 emissions, representing close to 40% of the global total. This is mainly due to the fact that we continue building the area the size of a New York City about every month across the globe. On the other hand, we have seen a renewed political focus and commitment on the built environment. Just earlier this year in March, a global gathering of ministers took place at the Buildings and Climate Global Forum in Paris, France. 70 countries signed up to the ministerial declaration, Déclaration de Chaillot, which puts a focus on the needed emissions reductions as well as resilience of the built environment globally. And back at COP28, the Buildings Breakthrough was launched by 27 global governments plus the European Union. And this sets out a clear ambition of 2030 net zero and resilient buildings to be the norm. The Buildings Breakthrough was also signed, among others, by China. Lastly, we see an increased mobilization of the financial sector. Since the COP26 and the GFANZ global movement, the role of finance and investment is recognized as a key enabler and driver for built environment decarbonization. Investors and lenders around the world are looking for ways to align their investments with science-based targets. They're using Science-Based Target Initiative, CREM, or other tools to align those investments, which is fundamental if we want to change the trajectory of the whole built environment. A few years ago, we worked with our global partners on what is our North Star? What do we need to achieve in order to tackle the emissions from the built environment? We understand them to be largely stemming from the use of energy to power and maintain buildings, about 10 gigatons per year, but also the construction materials that are needed around the world of about 4 gigatons. In order to get on track with our Paris Agreement goals, we need to halve these emissions imperatively by 2030. That means for any new building, it should be net zero in operation and reduce its upfront embodied carbon by at least 40 to 50%. Also, importantly, the retrofit of existing buildings needs to be ramped up very rapidly to over 2% annual rate around the world. Now, how do we achieve the halving of emissions by 2030? WBCSD, we've done quite a bit of work on this topic. First of all, understanding the whole life carbon emissions, clearly accounting for all these emissions embodied as well as operational. It is important that we look at all of it together. And then how do we actually halve emissions from construction, which is possible with an early approach on design and planning, but also how do we reach net zero in operation? This was the topic of our last piece of work that we put out just at the end of last year. And there, the picture is still quite mixed. At the moment, we do not have a globally consistent definition of what a net zero building is, and also national policy does not currently require it anywhere. So there's still substantial variation in standards and approaches. And hence, we really need that collaborative approach of driving emissions down, energy consumption down at a building level, but then also working on the supply side to make sure the energy infrastructure supports that net zero goal. Now, what is holding us back is that we are working in a very fragmented value chain. It is different players, different organizations with different incentives and motivations that are involved in the early planning and design, that are then involved in the construction of buildings, and ultimately those who operate and use the buildings. We need to involve all these actors along the value chain, from the manufacturing of materials to the construction, including architecture, engineering, to the developers, as well as the financiers and lenders. And all that working together with local governments and national governments who ultimately set the rules for everyone to work on. So back in COP26, we had developed, together with the Global Alliance for Buildings and Construction, our initial work on market transformation levers for the built environment. What this is trying to say is that if we are collectively to halve emissions by 2030 and reach net zero by no later than 2050, all actors need to focus on three fundamental things. It's to align behind whole life carbon assessment, how we account for it, how we measure it, and request it in every project. To then put carbon next to cost in all decision-making related to building projects, and ultimately to transform the supply and demand dynamics through different ways of contracting, risk and benefit sharing, regulation. This was the initial work around how everyone in this sector can work together. We then, last year, went into workshops with companies along the whole value chain to understand what holds us all back. What are the barriers that we are facing in the value chain with regards to these three levers? And from there to come up with a series of system interventions. So how do we help the whole value chain overcome those barriers? And these topics that have come up in these workshops are not surprisingly around the issue of standards and definitions, the data, the integration of risks and costs in decision-making, and ultimately operating at the highest levels of transparency and accountability. But also in terms of opportunities, how to change demand-supply dynamics through different contracting models, through innovation and new financing models, to pull proven solutions that decarbonize into the market, and how to create much stronger in-market evidence for the transformation to happen. These workshops that were held online as well as in person brought together several hundred professionals from more than 100 organizations, representing large companies, representing organizations in the built environment value chain. And it came up with a collective action agenda, a shared action agenda, that if we all focus on these 11 interventions, we believe we can make a strong difference for the built environment in the next 2 to 3 years. Around whole life carbon, we need to align and get an understanding for how we do the assessment and measurement of carbon. We then need to work on getting the data, having it shared along the value chain, and ultimately work on our understanding and definitions of targets and metrics to measure that we are making progress. To then work on the integration of carbon into decision-making, working on a common approach for how we integrate the carbon cost into real estate, and also how that then informs transition risk as well as physical risk assessment, which is fundamental if we are to move the market at scale. And then lastly, to work on the demand and supply relationships by finding better ways of sharing performance risk, but also benefits along the value chain, not to push the risk to the weakest link, but how do we work together in contracting. Also, market commitments for certain proven decarbonization solutions. And lastly, the financing of stranding assets and how do we create financial tools to overcome that issue. And tenants need to be mobilized so that we start changing what we request from our buildings going forward. This is the global action agenda co-created by these many organizations throughout last year. And we then launched it at the Climate Global Forum in March in Paris. And we were very fortunate to have a strong group of organizations endorsing it, showing their support to these global shared actions. For us to succeed, we need all stakeholders to work on this together. Value chain businesses, from manufacturing to architecture, engineering to real estate, the finance sector to really set the requirements and push the incentives up into the value chain to deliver these performance goals. And end users, cities, of course, as not only owners themselves, but also orchestrators of action and regulators and national governments. There are examples of how this market transformation can happen. And we hope we will soon see more and more organizations and companies come forward and also show their contribution to this. Arup, global engineering firm, committed at COP26 to conduct whole life carbon assessments on all their building projects as a prerequisite and basis for understanding the emissions and reducing them. Ramboll, another engineering firm out of the Nordics, then went a step further and said, well, we want to reduce the emissions from our new building project by 50% by 2030. So bringing their portfolio already in line with the 2030 target and need. NREP, today Urban Partners, a real estate developer based in the Nordics, committed to reach net zero across the full life cycle in their projects by 2028. And they also introduced an internal carbon tax to start shifting the decisions that they are taking on their projects. And London, through their London plan, are now requiring that whole life carbon assessments are conducted on all development projects in the city. These are examples of how the market transformation is happening in individual examples and projects. And we can take this to the next level through that deeper collaboration. Lastly, and coming back to the buildings breakthrough, there is a very strong connectivity and mutual support between the market transformation agenda, which has primarily come from a convening of businesses along the value chain, and the governmental agenda that has been created through the breakthrough development. The importance of standards and certifications, the demand creation, finance, but also research and deployment and capacity and skills are critical topics that the buildings breakthrough is taking forward under their ambition of near zero emission and resilient buildings to be the new normal by 2030. The market transformation can support that by creating the necessary collaboration between these different stakeholders to make sure in the next 2-3 years, we really come to align around critical issues and also show the action and show what is possible. With that, I hope to end on a positive note to show how we can work through deep collaboration together on these topics. I'd be very happy to hear from you any feedback you may have. Please do get in touch if you have any questions, and I wish you an excellent rest of the conference, and thank you very much for having me.
Hope you have enjoyed Mr. Hunziker's video.